Well, howdy friends, welcome to this afternoon's session talking about sustainability in the pork marketplace and a variety of topics with an industry leader that you may not get a chance to have the same global perspective as Ruth Kimmelshue every day. We'll introduce Ruth in a minute, but I just want to thank you for coming to this session brought to you by Cargill. We'll have a chance to do questions and answers later on in the program, so please take a moment to think about questions that you might have throughout our conversation. When we were preparing for this session, because of the variety of different topics that we wanted to be able to cover today, we kind of decided to do more of the fireside chat than more of the get up and talk with slides and then do Q&A at the end, really, so we could talk about some more in-depth topics and get a broader perspective on this global marketplace, because there's a lot going on in the global marketplace right now for pork and feed grain. So joining me is Ruth Kimmelshue, is Corporate Vice President for Cargill Animal Health and Nutrition. And actually you have a pretty broad purview even beyond just the swine industry, and we'll let you tell a little bit of your background in just a moment. But Ruth is one of 11 members of Cargill's executive committee, so not only responsible for the animal nutrition business here in North America and around the globe, but also has that perspective of what's happening across the Cargill business globally. Ruth, if you will, tell us a little bit about your farm background, because you've got a great story there, and also maybe the elevator speech, if you will, for Cargill's part of the business that you handle and your responsibilities.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. First of all, it's great to be with everyone today. In many ways, I feel like I'm coming home again. As you said, I am a fifth-generation family farmer. I grew up in Northern California on an almond and edible bean farm, but my family is originally from Illinois, dairymen as well as row crop farmers. I actually see a relative, a cousin, a distant cousin of mine who's in the room, which is super fun to just be able to connect with folks that do the really hard work of feeding the world. I have been at Cargill for most of my career and am in a very privileged position to see what happens in the world of food and agriculture. Cargill is a company that has been in existence for about 157 years. We are now on, I think, about our sixth generation of family shareholders. We are global. We operate in about 70 countries. We have 155,000 employees. And in my career, I've had the privilege to be in our grain and oilseeds business. My first job was buying grain from farmers in Memphis, Tennessee. And moved all over the Midwest, spent some time in Europe trading international soybean meal. I've led our salt business. Salt is more interesting than you would think for just a simple mineral that's sodium chloride, but it's actually, I used to say it's the sexiest business in Cargill. I then led our turkey business, which is based in Wichita, Kansas, and that's where I started to get some perspective on the animal production side, animal agriculture. And then I took an opportunity joining Cargill's executive team about 6 years ago to organize and lead our operations and supply chain organization. So that really is the background on how do we do what we do, how do we run our plants, how do we ensure we keep our employees safe, how do we produce safe food around the world, how do we move it from point A to point B, all of the supply chain components and aspects, logistics, transportation, sourcing of the raw materials and the ingredients. Really that whole package. And now most recently back into one of our businesses leading animal nutrition and health. Animal nutrition business is an old business for Cargill as well. It's been around since about 1893. Probably was the first value-added business that Cargill entered, where we took grains and turned them into some form of feed for animals back before the turn of the 20th century. And so it's really exciting to be a part of that business. And what I say now is, this is not your grandfather's feed company. The technology that's coming into the feed industry, the advances that we're making, the challenges that we're facing are really quite remarkable as it relates to the opportunities that we can lean into and some of the challenges that we have to address.
Yeah, well put. And of course, as I'm listening to you talk about your background, you came to that section on working supply chain and logistics. We could probably do a whole hour just on some of the challenges in that space, and
yes,
we may touch on that a little bit later on. But I want to start with sustainability. This is one of those, as I heard another presenter say it earlier in the week, this is the S word. People, I think when we started talking about this in agriculture some years ago, maybe really struggled to define it. What does it mean? What is it? And so I want to get your perspective, because it's viewed differently in different countries, different industries, different countries. We're talking about this being a global business. What do you hear from Cargill customers about what sustainability is and means, and what's Cargill doing in that space?
First thing I would say is that I believe and have seen through my own experience the fact that agriculture and farmers are the first true environmentalists. So coming from a farm background, what I know is that without sustaining our land, our resources, we can't continue to operate in agriculture. And so farmers have for a very, very long time worked hard to produce more with less. And I think that's a really important point, and one that I always try to bring through whenever I talk to groups, because as I'm sure you're aware, food and agriculture is criticized for contributing about 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And so we need to figure out, how do we tell our story more effectively? And then how do we continue to do what we've always done, which is produce more food to feed a growing population around the world with fewer inputs? And I think walking on the trade show floor, I see a lot of examples of technologies and advancements that are all intended to help producers do more with less. And that, I think, is at the heart of sustainability. The best quote I've seen on sustainability is actually an ancient Native American proverb. And I recently saw it on a hike with my family. We were out in Arizona. And it said, we do not inherit the land from our ancestors. We protect it for our children. And that really articulates, for me anyway, what sustainability is. It's really making sure that we use the resources that we have to produce what we need today, but we don't do it in such a way as to compromise the ability of those same resources to be able to produce what we need for tomorrow.
Well said. And as I'm thinking about the overall places where Cargill has a touch point in that sustainability, and that's a very different discussion if we're talking about producing hogs versus if we're talking about how we run our supply chain and so on. So when you look at Cargill's views on the subject, what's the company doing in those different areas of the business, or how are we kind of bringing that to life, that mindset, if you will, that you just described so well?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing we've done is we've said, okay, what areas can we most significantly impact? And what is most important to us? And I think each of us need to look in the mirror and say, what's important to me as it relates to sustainability, and what can I actually have a positive impact on? And so for Cargill, we've identified 4 areas: climate, land, water, and farmer livelihoods. And those are 4 areas that, regardless of where we operate in the world, we can positively impact, working with a whole range of stakeholders. First amongst them are producers, animal producers and farmers. And so we look at those 4 areas. We've been very diligent about measuring our impact and setting goals in each of those areas. What we know is that once we set the goals, we need to put in place programs to make progress, and we can't do it on our own. It requires all of the actors in the supply chain to work together to say, what do we need to do collectively, and where can we have the biggest influence on the outputs of those supply chains? And so we have put in place practices such as regenerative agriculture with production, with farmers who are growing crops. We've put in place different utilization of methane emissions from some of the animal production operations or animal processing operations to capture methane and then turn it into fuel. We have a program called See Further in our aqua nutrition business, which is a business that is under kind of my umbrella. And we work with salmon farmers in both the North Sea and off the coast of Chile to help them to use feed that is more efficiently produced to produce salmon that emits less carbon. So overall, we're reducing the carbon footprint of that salmon production operation. It takes technology and it takes patience. And I think it's going to also take multiple components and efforts. There is not a silver bullet to address some of the challenges that we have as it relates to sustainability. But working together, what we have seen and what we believe is that we will continue to make progress.
Use the word patience, so that naturally gets me thinking about the longer horizon. We've been talking about this topic for a few years. I think there's more of a general consensus that, hey, we as an industry have a role to play, have solutions to bring to the table, more excitingly. What do you think this conversation looks like 10 years from now? What does sustainability look like in agriculture a decade down the road? Because when you describe those goals, I'm thinking, okay, how do we move that ball forward toward whatever that future state is?
Yeah. I think that we don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I know that we will have learned along the way and that we will be facing into new technologies and new opportunities to continue to improve. You know, when you hear people talk about the commitments that they're making for reduction in carbon emissions, for example, lots of people are setting goals that are 10, 15, 20, 30 years out. I mean, some companies have said, oh, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. For me, that seems like a long time. The question, I think, is always, what are you doing now to impact that carbon neutrality or whatever your goal is? Recognizing that a part of those commitments involves new technology that is yet to present itself, new practices, new processes, new approaches. Cargill has made similar commitments where we have not made a carbon neutral commitment, but we've said we will reduce carbon emissions from our own operations by 10% by 2030. And carbon emissions in our supply chains by 30% by 2030. And we're making very real progress against that. Sometimes it's easier than others, depending on kind of what resources we have available, what sources of energy. But again, a great example, driving down here this morning, I was struck by the fact that as I'm driving through the farm fields of Iowa, farmers are not only growing crops, corn and soybeans, and there were plenty of hog barns along the way, they're also growing energy. The windmills that were in place in in many of the farm fields along the way, we wouldn't have seen that, we didn't see that as recently as 10 to 15 years ago. I saw solar panels outside some hog barns. Wouldn't have seen that 10 or 15 years ago. So when we think about what does the future look like, I think we don't know exactly, but every day we move forward and we learn a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think some of the what does that future look like come through some of the different partnerships that you're forming on the projects you're working on now. There are a lot of different stakeholders that have to play a role in that sustainability question, not just any one company or individual. Right? It's a pretty complex problem.
It's a very complex problem, and yes, there are many stakeholders. One of the privileges of being a privately owned company is we get to make investments in opportunities that may not return immediately, but that are really investments for the future. So a really interesting example that I'm learning about more and more every day is insect protein. An insect protein to replace animal protein for feed. And it's very nascent, it's very beginning, but it is fascinating to think about people who are going to be raising soldier flies and mealworms to use that protein as an ingredient ultimately to replace fish meal, for example, in salmon feed, or to use the oil that comes from the insects in swine feed, especially in some of the infant nutrition, young nutrition feeds that are important. And those new ingredients have interesting attributes and components that address specific issues that maybe we have found it very challenging to address using other ingredients. Another great example is Cargill has invested in a couple different businesses. One of them is called Diamond V, which is based in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And that business creates yeast-based fermentate that is helpful for gut health in animals and has proven to be very, very effective in replacing antibiotics previously used to help with growth in animals, to help to fight disease, and it's an all-natural source. Commercial, there's a human product called Epicor, which also helps with human gut health. It provides immune benefits. So those kinds of investments that are really adjacent to our more traditional agricultural investments, but are important for the future.
Yeah, well put. Thinking about animal agriculture in specific, one of the things you talked about earlier that really stuck out to me is the use of technology. And technology is one of those things I feel like in a lot of ways agriculture is forward thinking in many things, but maybe we have been slower than other industries to adopt some technologies, new technologies. And I want to get your take on that. What do you think are some of the barriers and challenges that we as an industry need to overcome to maybe take advantage of some of the things we could be doing in this industry?
Yeah, I think that in some ways it's a bit of a misperception that technology is not being adopted by agriculture. I think that generally, we don't have big data warehouses where we're capturing all kinds of data and information about agriculture. I like to say agriculture is an outside sport, and so the variables are always changing. And there is real value in capturing data and then analyzing that data to tell us something about production processes and practices and what provides or what creates better results. That said, I actually think agriculture is pretty good at adopting technology. When I first started in the industry around in the mid-'80s, I think the average corn yield in the United States was about 125 bushels to the acre. Today, we know that the average corn yield in the United States is about 225 bushels to the acre, plus or minus. And that improvement, using the same amount of land to produce more product, which is all sustainability related, has been made possible through technology and through the adoption of technology by farmers. And that's just the case for the corn production system. I know that we've seen similar improvements in yields and productivity in other parts of agriculture. All of that said, the more we learn about data, the more we learn about our ability to analyze the data, the more valuable we see that is. And so one of the things that we're doing in our animal nutrition business is helping our producers to put together the data that they have at their fingertips, to capture that data and to analyze that data, to use that analysis to create insights that will produce better outcomes. And that's a really exciting new space for us to pursue that data. I think that the opportunity is for us all to be aware of, the data that surrounds us every day and what does it really mean. I don't know about people in the room, but I have a few kids that are in college now, and I'm thinking data analytics is really quite an interesting space for kids to go into today, because that unlocking the power of that data is critical. It starts with being able to capture it, starts with being able to look at it and say, what does it really mean? And then our team in Cargill Animal Nutrition works really, really hard to take our customers' data and information and then create solutions that surround that customer with the products and the services that they need at the time in which they find themselves. Whether producer profitability is very high, whether producer profitability is very low. What is the set of offerings that we need to bring to the table to partner with producers to be successful?
Yeah, that's the magic. So often it feels like our reach exceeds our grasp when it comes to all of this data that we have. What do we do with it? And so I think that's a pretty exciting space for Cargill to get involved in to help us unlock some of that. Thinking about other places where Cargill's investing heavily, research, innovation, what are the types of innovations that you're working on now, things you're excited about that are going to help support customers? You've given us a good example there in the data space, but I wonder what else you're working on that say, hey, we're going to be talking about this in a couple of years and it's really cool.
Yeah. So one of the things that comes to mind is actually something that we've invested in the cattle industry. And it seems a little humorous, but it actually has potential to be promising. And it's called ZELP, and it's a mask that would go on a cow's nose that has a catalyst in it that breaks down the methane that the cow burps. And it breaks down the methane into less harmful gases, less harmful component parts that would positively impact emissions, methane emissions from cattle. So kind of funny. People have called and said, "Can I advertise on the masks like I would on the side of a football stadium?" Haven't gotten that far. And there's all kinds of challenges, obviously, associated with, well, how do you keep it on the cow, and will it really work, and how often do you need to change it, and what's the cost? Critical component. But when we think about the potential of that, along with some other wearable technology to capture data about the animal and the health of the animal, how much is the cow eating? How much is the cow drinking? Is she giving, is she behaving in a way that seems to be normal or abnormal? How do we use that data to inform them the care and feeding that we give to that animal. I think there are a lot of components that can be helpful with that kind of technology. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, it's kind of the far out technologies that we want to explore in simple ways to figure out, okay, how will that impact us positively, and how will that impact our customers? We are also investing in cultured meats and alternative proteins. We, as you know, I'm sure, are a significant producer of beef in the United States. Poultry around the world. Obviously, we have a significant feed business. So we're all about conventionally produced meats and animal protein. That said, we also believe it's really important for us to watch what is happening in the adjacent spaces, in the margin, because that will help to inform how we become better at those core businesses that we operate. And it will also help us to get a sense of what are consumers looking for in the products that they're consuming. And that's important then to bring to our customers to say, okay, here's what we're seeing. They want these attributes as it relates to sustainability. They want these attributes as it relates to taste and texture and different consumption patterns. This is what they're looking for in terms of traceability, knowing where their food comes from, all of those components. And so sometimes the investments are made to give us clues into what the future might hold for the areas that we already have substantial investment in, both in the U.S. and around the world.
As we wrap up our conversation, before we open it up for questions from our audience, like you sit on a few different boards, and a topic that I've been exposed to more and more in the last year or so is this concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to think about that through the lens specifically of the pork industry. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that you think we as pork industry professionals should be thinking about, and what should we be doing with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah. Well, so I like to say agriculture is a big tent, and there's lots of room for all people. I have a personal passion for gender inclusion, specifically and probably obviously for women in agriculture. It's something that I have a real heart for and a real passion about. For much of my career, I've been the only woman in the room. And I look around this room and I see lots of women, and I love that. It makes me feel really proud at the steps that we're taking together in agriculture. But I think about things like labor shortages that we're all facing, and that are really negatively impacting the profitability of hog producers, of feed millers, of meat processors. Labor is a big issue, and at the very face of it, why would we cut ourselves off from 50% of the population? Why would we not try to be as inclusive as we possibly can, bringing those voices and those good ideas and the perspectives and the experiences of half of the world's population to the table to help to solve these problems that we've been talking about: sustainability, productivity, all of the issues that we're facing, supply chain issues. And so I just encourage all of us to work together to make sure that people feel welcome under the big tent, because there's plenty of work to do. There's plenty of opportunity for all of us, and it's exciting to see what the future will look like as we continue to increase the inclusion and diversity of food and agriculture.
And as the dad of a 9-year-old daughter, thank you to you and the other women in the space who have been the only woman in the room for blazing a trail. This is an industry I'd feel very comfortable and proud of my daughter going into, should she choose to do that. And it's because of you and your counterparts who have opened those doors. All right, friends, we've had a great conversation with an industry leader here that, as I said at the beginning of the program, has a broader perspective than most of us are ever likely to have because of those different stops along the way you've had.